The guns had finally fallen silent across Europe, but for thousands of German soldiers, the war's end brought not relief, but a different kind of terror. Among them were men who had never imagined that defeat would carry them across an ocean to a land they had been taught to fear, only to discover that their captors possessed a kind of magic that would shatter everything they thought they knew about power, about connection, about what it meant to be truly free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dust hung in the air like a shroud over what remained of Kassel. The spring of 1945 had arrived, but it brought no renewal, only the acrid smell of burned wood and the metallic tang of rubble ground to powder. Werner Hoffman stood among the wreckage of his artillery unit, hands raised, watching American tanks roll through streets he no longer recognized. He was 28 years old, tall and lean from years of ration meals, his Wehrmacht uniform torn at the shoulder where shrapnel had grazed him 3 days earlier. Around him, other soldiers dropped their weapons with hollow clangs against broken pavement. Some wept. Others stared ahead with eyes that had seen too much and now saw nothing at all. Werner had served as a communications specialist with the 352nd Infantry Division, spending the last 3 years in concrete bunkers, routing encrypted messages between command posts. He had rarely fired a weapon. His war had been fought with radio equipment and cipher books, sending words he was forbidden to question to men he would never meet. In his breast pocket, wrapped in oilcloth, he carried a single photograph, his wife Anneliese and their daughter Greta, taken in the garden behind their apartment in Stuttgart. The picture was 2 years old now. Greta would be 5. He wondered if she still remembered his face. The Americans processed them with mechanical efficiency. Names recorded, identification tags collected, hands searched for concealed weapons. A young corporal with freckles and a Tennessee drawl gestured Werner toward a line of prisoners being loaded onto transport trucks. The soldier's rifle was slung casually over his shoulder, not aimed, not threatening. Just there. Werner had expected many things from capture. He had heard stories whispered in the bunkers during night watches, stories of Soviet camps where men were worked to death in Siberian mines, where winter killed more prisoners than bullets ever had. Stories of summary executions, of mass graves dug by the condemned themselves. But he had not expected this quiet, almost bored processing. No beatings. No curses. Just forms and lines and the smell of diesel exhaust as trucks rumbled to life. The journey to the prisoner collection point took 3 days. They traveled through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, cities reduced to skeletal frameworks, bridges collapsed into rivers, fields cratered and scorched. Germany was dying, and Werner felt each ruined kilometer like a wound in his own flesh. At the collection camp near Bremen, rumors spread like wildfire through the ranks of captured soldiers. The Americans were separating prisoners. Some would stay in Europe for reconstruction work. Others, and here voices dropped to nervous whispers, would be shipped across the Atlantic. To America itself. The word landed among the men like a grenade. America. The enemy's heartland. 3,000 miles of ocean away from everything they had ever known. Friedrich Adler, a former tank mechanic who had bunked near Werner in the last retreat, spat into the dirt. "They'll work us to death in their factories," he muttered, his Bavarian accent thick with bitterness. "Make us build the weapons they'll use to finish destroying Germany." But Klaus Reinhardt, older at 42, a schoolteacher from Hamburg who had been conscripted late in the war, shook his head slowly. "I heard they follow the Geneva Convention. That they have to feed us, shelter us." "Propaganda," Friedrich snapped. Werner said nothing. He had stopped believing in certainties the day he watched his commanding officer shoot himself rather than face capture. Now he simply waited, watching American soldiers move through the camp with their easy confidence, their casual laughter, their cigarettes and chocolate bars that seemed to materialize from endless supplies. On a gray morning in early May, the announcement came. Werner's name appeared on a transport list. He would be leaving for America within the week. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night, he lay on a thin blanket in a tent that smelled of canvas and mud, listening to the breathing of hundreds of other men suspended in the same terrible uncertainty. Outside, a generator hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle caught through the darkness. He thought of Anneliese. Of Greta's laugh, bright and fearless in the garden. Of the apartment in Stuttgart that might no longer exist. The Red Cross had set up a message station where prisoners could leave word for families, but responses took weeks, sometimes months. The silence was its own kind of death. The Liberty ship loomed against the docks of Bremerhaven like a gray fortress of riveted steel. USS William Patterson, her name stenciled in white letters on her bow. Werner climbed the gangway with hundreds of other prisoners, each step taking him farther from everything he had ever known. The hold where they were quartered was cavernous and dim, lined with bunks stacked 4 high. The air smelled of metal and diesel fuel and the sweat of frightened men. An American guard, older than most, with sergeant stripes on his sleeve, addressed them through a translator. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive adequate food and medical care. Any man who causes trouble will be disciplined. Any man who cooperates will be treated fairly. The words were spoken without emotion, or recitation of policy rather than a promise. But Werner noticed that the guard's rifle remained slung on his shoulder, not pointed at anyone. As the ship pulled away from the dock, men crowded at the few portholes to watch Germany recede into the distance. Some prayed. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight. Friedrich pressed his forehead against the cold steel bulkhead and said nothing at all. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. The first days were the worst. The sea rose and fell with nauseating regularity, and the hold filled with the sounds and smells of men who had never been on a ship before. Seasickness claimed half the prisoners. Buckets were distributed. The stench became almost unbearable. But on the third day, the Americans allowed small groups on deck for fresh air. Werner emerged from the hold into brilliant sunshine that hurt his eyes. Wind tore at his hair and filled his lungs with clean, cold air. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, blue-green and alive with whitecaps. Klaus stood beside him at the rail, gripping the metal with white knuckles. I never thought I would see this, he said quietly. I taught geography for 15 years. I showed students maps of the Atlantic. But to stand here. Werner understood. The scale of it was overwhelming. Germany had felt like the whole world for so long, the Reich's borders stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. But this ocean made all of that seem small, a narrow strip of contested land on the edge of something vaster than armies or ideologies. Meals were served twice daily in shifts. The food was plain but substantial, bread that was soft and white, not the dense black rye they had survived on for years. Soup with actual pieces of meat floating in it. Wheat coffee that was nonetheless hot and plentiful. They feed us better than our own officers did, Friedrich muttered one evening, staring at his tin plate with an expression caught between gratitude and resentment. An American sailor, young and sunburned, passed by and tossed a pack of Lucky Strikes onto their table. From the Red Cross, he said in broken German, grinning. Then he was gone, whistling something jazzy and incomprehensible. Friedrich picked up the cigarettes as if they might explode. What kind of enemy does this? Klaus lit one with shaking hands and inhaled deeply. Maybe not an enemy anymore, he said through a cloud of blue smoke. Just a victor who can afford generosity. Werner took a cigarette but didn't light it immediately. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling the tightly packed tobacco, the quality paper. In the last year of the war, German cigarettes had been mostly sawdust and hope. This was real tobacco. American abundance made tangible. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, Werner climbed to the deck. The ship cut through black water under a sky thick with stars that seemed impossibly bright out here, away from any land. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. A voice spoke from the shadows. Beautiful, isn't it? Werner turned to find an American guard leaning against a lifeboat davit. The man was perhaps 30, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He held out a canteen. Water, he said in careful German. Not poison. Werner hesitated, then accepted. The water was cold and clean, tasting faintly of metal. "Where are you from?" the guard asked. "Stuttgart," Werner replied. The American nodded. "My grandparents came from Munich. 1887, I still have cousins there." "Or I did." His voice trailed off. "War's a hell of a thing." Werner handed back the canteen. "Why are you kind to us?" The guard was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark water. "Because the war's over. And because my grandfather always said that Germans were good people who got led down a bad road." He turned to Werner. "You got family? A wife? A daughter? Then you've got something to go home to." The guard smiled, a tired expression that held no malice. "Get some sleep, friend. America's not what you expect." When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning mist on the 12th day, a strange silence fell over the deck. Werner stood among a crowd of prisoners, all of them staring at the copper figure rising from the harbor, her torch lifted against a sky streaked with pink and gold. They had seen her in propaganda films, always portrayed as a symbol of decadence, of false democracy, of a nation grown soft and weak. But here she stood, massive and solid and undeniably real, her face turned toward the sea as if welcoming the very men who had fought to destroy everything she represented. "So that's America," Klaus breathed beside Werner. Beyond the statue, Manhattan rose in vertical impossibility. Buildings taller than any Werner had ever imagined, crowding against each other like stone forests reaching for the clouds. Sunlight glinted off thousands of windows. Boats moved across the harbor in purposeful patterns. Everything spoke of scale, of industry, of a nation whose infrastructure had never felt a single bomb. Friedrich's voice was barely audible. "No wonder we lost." The processing center at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn was chaos made orderly through American efficiency. Prisoners were photographed, fingerprinted, examined by doctors who prodded and listened and made notes on clipboards. Forms were filled out in triplicate. Files were stamped and sorted. Werner stood in line for 3 hours, moving forward in increments, watching the machinery of American bureaucracy process hundreds of men with assembly line precision. It was impersonal but not cruel. The guards who directed them were firm but not aggressive. One even helped an older prisoner who stumbled, catching his elbow with a steadying hand. When Werner's turn came, a clerk with thick glasses and ink-stained fingers recorded his information in English, translating questions through a board interpreter. "Name? Werner Hoffman. Rank? Gefreiter. Corporal. Unit? 352nd Infantry Division. Communications Specialist." The clerk stamped forms with mechanical precision. A camera flashed, capturing Werner's exhausted face for posterity. A medical officer checked his eyes, his teeth, listened to his heart and lungs. "Healthy enough," the doctor concluded in English, making a notation. Then they were loaded onto trains. The journey inland unfolded like a fever dream. Werner pressed his face to the window as America rolled past in endless variation. First came the industrial sprawl of New Jersey, factories belching smoke, warehouses lined up like soldiers, rail yards vast enough to swallow entire German towns. Then farmland opened up, impossibly green and orderly. Fields stretched to horizons, interrupted by red barns and white farmhouses that looked like they belonged in children's storybooks. Cows grazed in pastures. Tractors moved through planted rows. Everything spoke of peace, of prosperity, of a land untouched by the devastation that had consumed Europe. "How is this possible?" Friedrich whispered, staring out the window. "We bombed London for years. We nearly starved Britain. But they did nothing to this?" Klaus, reading an American newspaper that someone had left behind, puzzling through the English with his teacher's determination, looked up. "We never had the means to reach them. They were always safe, 3,000 miles away, building more tanks, more planes, more of everything." He folded the paper slowly. "We fought a nation that could afford to feed its prisoners chocolate and cigarettes while waging war on 2 fronts. Children waved at the passing train from a dusty crossroads somewhere in Pennsylvania. Werner waved back without thinking, saw a little girl with blonde braids jump up and down with excitement. She reminded him of Greta. Night fell, and the train pushed onward. Men dozed fitfully in seats that were surprisingly comfortable compared to military transports. Guards walked the aisles but didn't harass anyone. One distributed blankets. Another offered cups of water from a cooler. "I don't understand this," Friedrich said into the darkness. "I don't understand any of this." Werner had no answer. He felt the same deep confusion, the same sense that something fundamental about the world he had believed in was cracking apart. Just before dawn, the train pulled into a small station somewhere in the middle of America. The sign read Allenville, Indiana. Guards roused the prisoners, directed them onto the platform where army trucks waited with engines rumbling. The air smelled different here, not of salt and sea, but of earth and growing things. It was late spring, and the Midwestern night was warm and alive with the sound of insects. They drove for another hour, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to pink-streaked gold. The landscape was flat and fertile, broken by occasional farmhouses and stands of trees. Everything felt vast and open in a way that German geography never had. The camp appeared gradually through ground mist, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. But the towers were unmanned, Werner noticed. The fences, while present, seemed more symbolic than threatening. An American flag snapped in the morning breeze above the main gate. A sign in English and German read, "Camp Allenville Prisoner of War Facility." The trucks rolled through open gates and stopped in a dusty yard. An American officer, middle-aged with silver in his hair and captain's bars on his collar, stood waiting. When the prisoners had assembled, he spoke in accented but clear German. "Gentlemen, I am Captain Robert Hayes, commanding officer of this facility. You are prisoners of war, but you will be treated with dignity as outlined in the Geneva Convention. You will be fed adequate meals. You will be provided shelter and medical care. Many of you will be assigned work details, agricultural labor primarily. You will be compensated with small wages that you may use at the camp canteen." He paused, looking over the assembled men with an expression that was neither hostile nor particularly friendly, just professional. "You will follow orders. You will not attempt escape. Any man who does will face consequences. But if you cooperate, your time here will pass without incident." Another pause. "The war is over, gentlemen. You are safe here. That is a promise." Safe. The word hung in the warm Indiana air like a question. Werner looked around at his fellow prisoners. Saw the same confusion reflected in dozens of faces. They had prepared for cruelty, for punishment, for the victor's revenge. Instead, they had been offered safety. The barracks were simple but clean. Rows of bunks with thin mattresses, real sheets and blankets, small windows that let in light and air. The floors were wooden and swept. There was a stove for winter heating. Toilets and showers stood in an attached building, crude by civilian standards but palace-like compared to the conditions they had endured in the final months of the war. Werner claimed an upper bunk near a window. Friedrich took the bed below. Klaus settled nearby, already organizing his few possessions with a teacher's instinct for order. That evening, they were called to the mess hall for their first meal in camp. The building was large and plain, with long tables and benches. The smell that greeted them stopped several men in their tracks. Bread. Real bread, fresh from ovens. And something else, meat cooking, potatoes, the rich aroma of food prepared in quantity but without the desperation of starvation rations. They filed through a serving line where American cooks, not prisoners, loaded tin plates with generous portions. Roasted chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. Bread with actual butter. A cup of coffee or milk to drink. Werner sat with his plate in disbelief. This was more food than he had seen at one time in months. Around him, men ate in stunned silence or with tears streaming down their faces. "This is a trick," Friedrich said, but he was eating as he spoke, unable to stop himself. "They'll starve us later. This is just to make us soft." Klaus shook his head slowly. I don't think so. Look at the cooks. Look at the guards. This is routine for them. This is normal. And that was perhaps the most shocking realization of all. This abundance, this casual, everyday plenty, was simply American normal. Not a special display. Not propaganda. Just the standard ration for prisoners of war. After dinner, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple across the flat Indiana horizon, Werner walked the perimeter of the camp. The fence was there, yes. But it was low enough to climb if someone truly wanted to. The guard towers remained empty. A single guard strolled past, nodding to Werner without hostility. Where would I even run to? Werner thought. And what would I be running from? That night, lying on his bunk listening to the unfamiliar sounds of American crickets and distant trains, Werner felt the first real stirring of something he couldn't name. Not quite hope. Not quite peace. Just a tiny crack in the certainty that had carried him through years of war. A crack through which something unexpected might enter. The second day brought work assignments. Werner, Klaus, and Friedrich were assigned to an agricultural detail at a nearby farm. They rode in the back of an open truck through countryside that seemed to glow with early summer green, past fields where crops grew in perfect rows and farmhouses stood painted and proud. The farm belonged to a man named John Richter, a second-generation German-American whose grandfather had emigrated from Bavaria. He was perhaps 60, weathered and strong, with eyes that assessed the prisoners with practical rather than hostile interest. "You boys know anything about farming?" he asked in German that carried a strong American accent but was perfectly understandable. Werner shook his head. "I worked in communications. Radios." Klaus smiled slightly. "I taught school." Friedrich shrugged. "I fixed tanks." Richter laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. "Well, you'll learn. Work's not complicated. Just takes a strong back and a willingness to sweat." They spent the day clearing irrigation ditches, hard physical labor under a sun that felt different from European sun, more direct somehow, hotter but cleaner. An American guard watched from the shade but didn't interfere. Richter worked alongside them, showing them what needed doing, offering water when they paused. At midday, his wife brought lunch, sandwiches with thick slices of ham, cold lemonade, cookies still warm from the oven. She was a round, cheerful woman who smiled at them with neither pity nor contempt, just the practical friendliness of a farmer's wife feeding workers. "You boys eat up," she said in English, then added in broken German, "more food if hungry." They ate in the shade of a huge oak tree, tasting food that seemed impossibly fresh and plentiful. Werner bit into his sandwich and had to close his eyes against the sudden, overwhelming memory of peacetime, of Anneliese making lunch in their apartment, of Greta demanding cookies, of the ordinary abundance he had once taken for granted. "Strange enemy," Klaus murmured, echoing Friedrich's earlier words. But Friedrich was silent, staring at his sandwich as if it were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Days blurred into a week. The routine became familiar. Morning muster. Breakfast in the mess hall. Truck to the farm. Work under the sun. Lunch with the Richters. More work. Return to camp. Dinner. Evening free time. Lights out. It was not freedom, but it was not punishment either. It existed in some strange middle space that none of them had words for. The letters started arriving in the second week. The Red Cross had established a system for delivering mail to and from prisoner of war camps. It was slow, letters took weeks to cross the ocean and pass through military censors, but it worked. Werner's name was called one evening during mail distribution. His hands shook as he took the thin envelope, recognizing Anneliese's handwriting immediately. He sat on his bunk and read by the light of the setting sun through his window. "My dearest Werner. The Red Cross told me you are alive and in America. I wept for an hour when I received the news. I had feared the worst. Stuttgart is damaged but standing. Our apartment is intact, though the windows are gone and we have covered them with boards. There is little food, but we manage. Greta asks about you every day. She remembers you, Werner. She remembers her papa. I do not know when you will come home, but I will wait. We will wait. Be safe. Be strong. We love you. Always, Anneliese. Werner read the letter 3 times, then pressed it to his chest. Around him, other men were reading their own letters, and the barracks was silent except for the sound of grown men crying quietly into their pillows. That night, he lay awake long into the darkness, thinking about the impossibility of it all. He was a prisoner of war, thousands of miles from home. Yet he had received a letter from his wife. He had been fed better than he had been in years. He worked hard but was treated with a baseline decency that made no sense according to everything he had been taught about the enemy. The confusion was almost physically painful. It was Friedrich who broke first. 2 weeks into their time at Camp Allenville, during evening free time, he suddenly stood up from where he had been sitting silently and spoke loud enough for the entire barracks to hear. They're doing this on purpose. Men looked up from books, from letters, from quiet conversations. What are you talking about? Klaus asked. Friedrich's face was flushed, his hands clenched into fists. All of this. The food. The kindness. The letters home. They're trying to break us. Not with cruelty, that would make us harder. They're breaking us with softness. Werner felt something cold move through his chest. Because Friedrich was right, in a way. They were being changed. Slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. Maybe, Klaus said quietly, we needed to be broken. Maybe we believed in something that deserved to shatter. Friedrich turned on him with fury. Traitor. No, Klaus said, his teacher's voice carrying calm authority. Just someone finally willing to see the truth. The argument died there, but the tension remained. The men divided, not openly, but in the private spaces of their thoughts. Some, like Friedrich, clung to the old certainties, seeing every American kindness as manipulation. Others, like Klaus, began to question everything they had believed. Werner stood somewhere in between, caught in the terrible space where one worldview had crumbled but another had not yet formed to replace it. And then came the telephone. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into their captivity. Captain Hayes called an assembly in the main yard. The prisoners gathered in the warm sunshine, curious and weary. Gentlemen, Hayes said through his translator, the International Red Cross has authorized a program. Certain prisoners, those who have demonstrated good behavior and whose families have registered addresses, will be permitted to make supervised telephone calls home. The words landed like artillery shells. Telephone calls. Home. Across an ocean. Murmurs swept through the assembled men. Several laughed outright, thinking it was a joke. Telephone calls to Germany? Impossible. The technology didn't work that way. Long-distance lines were unreliable even within Germany. International calls were reserved for the highest levels of government and military command. This was fantasy. But Hayes continued, unperturbed. The calls will be brief, no more than 5 minutes. They will be monitored. But you will have the opportunity to speak with your families, to let them know you are safe. He gestured toward the administration building. A list of eligible prisoners has been compiled. If your name is called, report to the communications room. Werner's name was on the list. His heart hammered as he walked toward the building with a dozen other men. They entered a small office where a black rotary telephone sat on a desk like an artifact from another world. An American operator sat beside it, patient and professional. A translator stood nearby. The first man stepped forward, nervous as a condemned prisoner. The operator asked for the registered address, made a series of calls in rapid English, manipulated switches on a board Werner didn't understand. There was a long pause. Then, crackling through vast distance and undersea cables and switching stations across 2 continents, a voice emerged from the receiver. A woman's voice, speaking German, faint but unmistakable. The prisoner grabbed the phone with shaking hands. Mama? Mama, is that you? The room fell silent except for that impossible conversation. The man spoke rapidly, crying, laughing, his words tumbling over each other. 5 minutes passed in heartbeats. The operator gently indicated time was up. The man thanked her in broken English, handed back the receiver, and stumbled to a chair where he sat with his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. Werner's turn came. His hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped the receiver. The operator smiled at him, not mockingly, but with genuine kindness, and helped him hold it to his ear. The process took minutes that felt like hours. Rings and clicks and distant mechanical sounds. Then, faint and ghostly through an impossible distance. "Hello?" Annelise's voice. Werner's throat closed completely. He couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. "Hello," she said again, uncertain. "Who is this?" "Annelise." His voice cracked on her name. "It's Werner. I'm calling from America." Silence on the line. Then a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. "Werner? Werner, is it really you?" "It's me. I'm alive. I'm safe. I wanted you to know." "Oh God, Werner. Oh my God. I can hear you. How is this possible?" "I don't know." He was crying now, not caring who saw. "I don't know how it's possible. But I'm here. I'm healthy. They're treating us well. I'm going to come home. Do you understand? I'm going to come home." Greta's voice in the background, high and bright. "Is that Papa? Is that my Papa?" "Yes, my love," Annelise said, and Werner heard her pick up the child. "Say hello to Papa." "Papa." Greta's voice, impossibly clear across 3,000 miles of ocean and wire. "Papa, where are you coming home?" Werner's knees gave out. He slid to the floor, still clutching the phone, and heard himself making sounds that were not quite words. The operator moved to help him, but the translator held her back, understanding that some moments were too sacred to interrupt. "Soon, little one," Werner managed. "Soon. Be good for Mama. I love you both. I love you so much." The 5 minutes ended. The operator gently took the phone, disconnected the call with professional efficiency. Werner sat on the floor, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Klaus helped him to his feet, guided him outside into sunshine that seemed too bright, too normal for what he had just experienced. "I spoke to my wife," Werner said, his voice hollow with wonder. "I spoke to my daughter. Across the ocean. It was instant. I heard her voice like she was in the next room." That night, the barracks was different. Men who had made calls sat in stunned silence or spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the miracle they had witnessed. Men whose names had not been called listened with hungry eyes, desperate for their own turn. Friedrich sat alone on his bunk, face turned to the wall. Werner lay staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning. He thought of the years he had spent routing military communications, of the primitive equipment, the unreliable connections, the constant static and interference. He thought of the propaganda that had told them America was weak, decadent, barely industrialized. And then he thought of the casual efficiency with which an American operator had connected him to his wife in Stuttgart, as if such a thing were routine. As if the entire world were wired together in a vast invisible network that carried voices and information at the speed of electricity. Germany had never had anything like this. Not for civilians. Not reliably. Not freely. The Reich had controlled every wire, every broadcast, every piece of information, rationing connection like bullets or bread. And he had helped them do it, never questioning, never imagining that another way was possible. Now he had heard his daughter's voice carried across an ocean by a technology so advanced, so casually deployed, that it made everything he thought he knew about power and progress seem like a child's drawing compared to a master's painting. Sleep would not come. Werner rose and walked outside. The night was warm and alive with cricket song. Stars blazed overhead in patterns unfamiliar this far west. A guard on patrol nodded to him but didn't stop him from walking the camp's perimeter. He stopped at the fence and looked out at the dark Indiana farmland stretching to invisible horizons. Somewhere out there, wires ran beneath or above ground, carrying voices, carrying news, carrying the invisible threads that held this vast nation together. And somewhere far to the east, across an ocean that had once seemed like the edge of the world, those same wires reached his family. Made distance meaningless. Made isolation obsolete. A single thought formed in Werner's mind, terrifying and irresistible. What else were we wrong about? Behind him, the barracks was quiet except for the sounds of men sleeping or trying to. Inside, Friedrich still faced the wall, refusing to acknowledge what was happening to them all. But Werner understood now. The war they had fought was over. They had lost that war definitively, completely. But another kind of war was beginning. A war for minds and hearts and futures. A war fought not with bullets but with kindness and abundance and the shocking demonstration of what freedom could build. And as Werner stood in the warm American night, listening to crickets and distant trains and the invisible hum of a connected world, he felt the last pieces of his old certainty crumble away, leaving in their place something fragile and frightening and possibly, just possibly, like hope. Messages, about encrypted orders he was forbidden to question, about a system designed to control rather than connect. Then, he said carefully, communication was a weapon. A tool for command and control. Information flowed only in approved channels, only carrying approved messages. He gestured at the new building. Now, it's a bridge. A way for people to reach each other, to share ideas, to stay connected. The wires are the same, but the purpose is completely different. The journalist scribbled notes. Some say Germany is losing its identity, becoming too Americanized. Werner shook his head. We're not becoming American. We're becoming something new, German but democratic, strong but free, connected but diverse. We're building what we should have built all along, if we'd had the wisdom to see it. That evening, he returned home to find Greta, now 15, studying at the kitchen table. Beside her textbooks lay an application for a student exchange program, a year in America, studying at an American high school. "Papa," she asked nervously. "What do you think?" Werner picked up the application, remembering a ship crossing an ocean, a camp in Indiana, a telephone call that changed everything. He thought of John and Mrs. Richter, of Sergeant Chen, of Captain Hayes, of all the Americans who had shown him a different world. "I think," he said slowly, "that understanding between people, real understanding, is the only thing that makes peace possible. And that requires connection." He smiled at his daughter. "You should go. Learn. Make friends. Build bridges." Greta's face lit up. "Will you help me with my English essay for the application?" "Of course." They sat together at the table, father and daughter, working on words that would carry her across an ocean he had once crossed as a prisoner. But she would cross as a student, a citizen of a new Germany, part of a generation that would ensure the mistakes of the past stayed buried. Werner Hoffman stood in the communications center of Stuttgart's new radio station, watching technicians prepare for a live broadcast. At 53, his hair was gray, but his eyes remained sharp, engaged, curious. He had come far from that defeated soldier standing in the ruins of Kassel. He was now a professor at the Technical University, teaching communications theory and democratic media systems. His students were young people who barely remembered the war, who knew Hitler only from history books, who took freedom of speech and open debate for granted. Which was exactly how it should be. The radio host called him over. "Professor Hoffman, we're ready for the interview." The topic was the upcoming 20th anniversary of the war's end. Werner had been asked to speak about his experiences as a POW, about the transformation he had witnessed and participated in. As the red light blinked on, signaling they were live, Werner thought about what to say. About camps and kindness, about telephones and transformation, about enemies who became teachers and prisoners who became free. "Professor," the host began, "you were a prisoner of war in America. That experience changed your life, didn't it?" "It changed my understanding of the world," Werner said. "I went to America expecting punishment. Instead, I found something I had never imagined, a society built on principles I had been taught were weak, but which proved to be profoundly strong. What was the most important lesson you learned? Werner was quiet for a moment, thinking. That real strength doesn't come from controlling people, but from connecting them. That information, freely flowing, creates resilience that force never can. And that yesterday's enemy can become today's teacher, if you're willing to listen. Do you think Germany has truly learned that lesson? Some of us have, Werner said honestly. And we're teaching it to our children, and they'll teach it to theirs. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens wire by wire, person by person, choice by choice. He paused. But yes, I believe we've learned. The question is whether we'll remember. After the interview, Werner walked through Stuttgart's rebuilt city center. Cafes buzzed with conversation. Newspaper stands displayed a dozen different publications. Telephone booths stood on corners, ordinary and unremarkable, as they should be. He stopped at one, on impulse, and placed a call. It connected instantly, the technology now so advanced, so reliable, that no one thought twice about it. Hello? Greta's voice answered. She was in Hamburg now, working as a translator for an international trade organization, married with 2 young children of her own. It's your father. Just calling to hear your voice. She laughed. Papa, you're becoming sentimental in your old age. Perhaps. How are my grandchildren? Loud, energetic, and asking when Opa will visit. Soon, he promised. Tell them Opa has stories to tell them. About wires and voices and how the world changed. After he hung up, Werner stood on the busy Stuttgart street, watching people go about their lives, free, connected, arguing in cafes about politics, buying newspapers with competing viewpoints, living without fear that disagreement meant danger. This was what he had fought for in those years after returning. This casual, unremarkable freedom. This ordinary miracle of a society that could argue without tearing itself apart, that could connect without controlling, that could be strong without being cruel. He thought of Friedrich, who had died 5 years earlier, never quite reconciling himself to the new Germany, bitter to the end. He thought of Klaus, now retired but still teaching part-time, still planting seeds of democratic thought. He thought of the Richters, both gone now, but their kindness living on in the Germany they had helped create. And he thought of that telephone call, so many years ago in a camp in Indiana. The moment when he had heard his daughter's voice across an impossible distance and realized that the world was smaller, more connected, more full of possibility than he had ever imagined. That call had been more than communication. It had been a doorway to a new understanding of what human society could be. And he had spent his life since then trying to walk through that door and hold it open for others. Werner Hoffman, now 63 and nearing retirement, sat in his university office surrounded by books and papers. A young doctoral student, born after the war, sat across from him, preparing to interview him for a thesis on post-war reconstruction. Professor, there's something I don't understand, the student said. The Americans defeated you, imprisoned you. Why did you come back and advocate for adopting their system? Wasn't that? I don't know, surrender? Werner smiled at the question he had been asked 100 times in 100 different ways. Let me tell you about a telephone call, he began. He told the story, all of it. The defeat, the crossing, the camp, the unexpected kindness, the moment when he heard Annaliese's voice through a device that should not have been able to work, in a system that should not have been stable, in a society that should not have been strong. I learned that I had been lied to about everything important, he concluded. Not just by propaganda, but by my own assumptions. I had believed that strength came from control, from uniformity, from silencing dissent. But the Americans showed me something different, that strength comes from connection, from diversity, from allowing argument and disagreement within a framework of shared values. And you think Germany has truly adopted that? Werner gestured out his window at the university campus, where students from a dozen countries studied together, where protests and debates happened freely, where information flowed without censorship. We're still learning, he said. Still building. Still connecting. But yes, we've changed. fundamentally changed. And we can never go back to what we were, because we've seen what's possible when people are free to connect, to question, to build together rather than being forced to march in lockstep. The student nodded thoughtfully. One more question. If you could go back and talk to yourself in 1945, standing in the ruins of Castle, what would you say? Werner thought about that young man, defeated and frightened, about to embark on a journey he couldn't imagine. About to have every certainty shattered and replaced with something better. I would tell him, Werner said slowly, that the war he thought he lost was just the beginning. That the real battle, the one worth fighting, was for understanding, for connection, for building a world where enemies could become friends and barriers could become bridges. He paused. And I would tell him that he was about to make a telephone call that would change his life. Just a telephone call? Just a telephone call, Werner agreed. But it carried more than my voice. It carried proof that another way was possible. That distance could be overcome, that isolation could be defeated, that human beings could reach across oceans and ideologies and past hatreds to simply talk. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the campus, at the wires strung overhead carrying voices and data, at the students moving freely in a space where ideas competed without violence. We built a Germany that my younger self would barely recognize, he said. And thank God for that. We needed to become unrecognizable. We needed to be transformed. The student packed up his notes, thanked Werner, and left. Werner sat alone in his office as the afternoon light faded, thinking about journeys and transformations, about the long road from captivity to freedom, from ignorance to understanding. His phone rang, the direct line on his desk. He picked it up without thinking, the gesture automatic after decades. Hello? Papa. It's Greta. I'm at the airport. I'm bringing your grandchildren to visit this weekend. Is that still good? Perfect, Werner said, his face breaking into a smile. Max wants to know if you'll tell them your America stories. Always, Werner promised. I'll tell them about a camp in Indiana, about a farmer named John Richter, about jazz music and democracy classes and the miracle of voices traveling through wires. They love those stories. Even if they think they're ancient history. After he hung up, Werner sat for a long moment with his hands still on the receiver. Ancient history to his grandchildren. A lived experience to him. But the lessons, those were timeless. He had been captured, transported, transformed. He had learned that defeat could be the beginning of victory, that surrender could be the path to freedom, that enemies could become teachers if you had the courage to learn. And he had carried those lessons home, planted them in German soil, and watched them grow into something beautiful and strong and free. Outside, the sun was setting over Stuttgart, casting long shadows across a city rebuilt, a nation reborn, a people who had learned, painfully, slowly, but genuinely, that connection was stronger than isolation, that openness was stronger than control, that the wires connecting humans in free communication were more powerful than any weapon. Werner closed his eyes and heard, in memory, his daughter's voice from 25 years ago, carried across an ocean by invisible threads of copper and faith. Papa, where are you coming home? He had come home. And he had spent his life making sure that home was worth returning to, a place where voices could travel freely, where ideas could flow without fear, where the wires that connected people carried hope instead of commands. The war was over. The real victory had begun. And it would continue, wire by wire, voice by voice, generation by generation, until the lessons learned in captivity became so deeply embedded in freedom that no one could imagine going back. Werner opened his eyes, stood, and turned off his office light. He had work to do, always more work. More students to teach, more seeds to plant, more connections to make. The telephone on his desk sat silent now, but ready. Always ready to carry voices across distance, to bridge divides, to prove that human beings, for all their capacity for hatred, had an even greater capacity for connection. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.